Hello students, the subject matter of this lecture is challenges to the nation state in the post-Cold War era. Now before I go into these challenges, I would like to say a few words about the nation state as an institution or as an entity which has been the sole actor in international relations during the course of the 20th century, during the course of much of the 20th century. In fact, it was the chief actor, if not the only actor. Now, nation state, the word nation state actually carries certain connotations, which I expect most of you should be familiar with. Because this institution or entity called nation state actually originated way back in 1648 following the peace treaty of Westphalia, which actually ended the long 30 years war between the Catholics and the Protestants in Europe. Since then, actually, what emerged in Europe and what was subsequently emulated in other parts of the world was this entity or institution called nation state. In fact, basically, a nation state denotes a territory which is inhabited by a relatively homogeneous group of people who share certain things in common like language, religion, customs, manners, culture, and so on and so forth. In fact, this is how the European nation states originated. The nation states of Britain, nation states of France, Germany, Italy, and so on and so forth. Of course, as a result of the emergence of the nation states, Europe witnessed a tremendous escalation in conflict for domination, for hegemony, for superiority, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that this became the accepted actor in the international system, that the nation state was the principal actor or the sole actor. In fact, what were the principal features of this nation state? I think if I may, as was accepted during the course of the 20th century, I may emphasize some of these. In fact, what happened was that, after the end of the Second World War, following decolonization, a large number of new countries, new states emerged onto the world scene. Now, these states actually, if you apply the European definition or the European criteria, were not strictly speaking nation states. Because what happened was that, these countries were essentially under colonial domination, and before the arrival of the colonial powers, they actually had not acquired some of the basic features, which would really qualify them as nation states. So therefore, what happened was that many of these states actually were actually multi-nation states. What happened was that some degree of secularity, national secularity was conferred on them, irrespective of languages, faiths, and ethnic background, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that these states were essentially, states which were put together, by the force of circumstances. And these circumstances were purely, their emergence from the colonial bondage and so on and so forth. I can give examples of many countries, particularly the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was definitely a multi-nation state. Yugoslavia was a multi-nation state. Czechoslovakia, which subsequently disintegrated, actually. These three states that I have just referred to, actually, they all disintegrated at the end of, at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the post-Cold War era. And so, one can refer to these states as very much as multi-nation states. Now, I'm not going into the controversy as to whether India is, strictly speaking, a nation state or a multi-nation state. That is a debate, actually, which lies elsewhere. So I will not go into that. Now, basically, what happened was that, these states were composed of many ethnic groups. These ethnic groups, for instance, did not have the kind of identity and the kind of respect and the kind of recognition that they actually craved for or they wanted. This was a fault line, I think, if I can use that expression. Now, of course, the United Nations Charter provided a lot of safeguards, a large number of safeguards. For instance, how that there should be no interference in the internal affairs of other states. States are sovereign and supreme within their own territory, and they will conduct their affairs according to their own choice and their own preferences, and so on and so forth. And of course, the United Nations Charter also laid down, the basic norms for interstate conduct. Now, the sanctity of the territoriality of the states was a very important feature of the nation-state system during the Cold War period, during much of the 20th century. That the territorial boundaries which had been drawn following the end of the Second World War, and particularly after the end of colonialism, were absolutely sacrosanct, meaning that they cannot be touched, they cannot be challenged, and so on and so forth. And of course, another important feature was the equality of the sovereign equality of the nation states. Their sovereign status, for instance, cannot be challenged or cannot be in any way questioned. So you can say that, these were some of the privileges, benefits, advantages that the nation state enjoyed during the Cold War period, I would say during much of the 20th century. At the same time, I would once again remind you that many of these states actually were not strictly nation states. They had many fault lines. And those fault lines actually were exposed when the Cold War ended. Now, what happened was that, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War was advantageous for a few states. They were better defined territorially. I can refer to particularly two examples. Germany. Now, I'm sure all of you know that following the end of the Second World War, Germany was partitioned. West Germany became a part of the Western Bloc, and East Germany became a part of the Eastern Bloc. Now, one of the most notable developments following the end of the Cold War in 1989 was, of course, the peaceful reunification of Germany in October 1990. Now, that was actually a very major development, because after all, the German people wanted this unification, and so far, the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc actually, they stood in the way. But with the end of the Cold War, this disagreement actually came to an end, and they both agreed, that is the United States and its allies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other, that the two Germanys should be reunited. Another instance of reunification was the unification of the two Yemens in the Arab world. I'm sure you are aware of that. At the same time, this integration, in fact, what I'm trying to draw your attention to, that the post-Cold War period actually saw both integration and disintegration. Now, so far as disintegration is concerned, I have already referred to the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, of course, happened because of many reasons. I do not propose to go into a detailed discussion of that. But among them, of course, was the fact that the unviability of the Soviet system, particularly the Soviet economy, on the one hand. On the other hand, the unviability of these multiple ethnic groups which actually cohabited within the Soviet Union. In fact, the largest ethnic group within the Soviet Union are the Russians, or were the Russians. But apart from the Russians, there were, of course, other ethnic groups like Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and all the rest of it. In fact, the Soviet Union was comprised of 15 republics, and you can say that all these 15 republics actually constituted a particular nation. So the inevitable happened. When the Soviet Union actually faced this monumental crisis in 1991, it simply broke apart. And what took its place was, of course, 15 newly established or newly emerged sovereign entities. So far as Yugoslavia was concerned, Yugoslavia was also some kind of a hodgepodge. In fact, various ethnic groups who were put together. I think if you go back in history, Yugoslavia was originally a part of the Ottoman Empire before the First World War. But after the end of the First World War, actually the Yugoslav state was created in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Essentially it was a conglomeration of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Macedonians, Kosovans, and so on and so forth. Each of them actually having very distinctive ethnic and one might even argue national identity. So therefore Yugoslavia, in fact in 1991, the disintegration of Yugoslavia started. It's a long story. I do not have the time to go into that. But what happened was that it essentially culminated in a civil war, which lasted between 1991 and 1995. And it was one of the most brutal civil wars that the world has seen, particularly since the end of the Second World War. And finally, the culmination was, of course, the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the emergence of several new states, like Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, then Slovenia, Macedonia, and so on and so forth. The third country that I refer to is Czechoslovakia. In fact, Czechoslovakia was also a creation of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. But Czechoslovakia existed as it is essentially a state which comprises the Czechs, which is an ethnic group in their own right, and the Slovaks, which is another ethnic group. Now, they actually came to an understanding that they were no longer able to live together, and they agreed to part company. But it happened, unlike Yugoslavia, it actually happened peacefully. They agreed to separate, and in 1993, two new states emerged, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So this is how, in fact, of course, apart from that, there took place other separations. Eritrea separated from Ethiopia in Africa. Bosnia-Herzegovina separated, I have already mentioned that, from Serbia in 1995. Kosovo emerged as an independent entity. It was a part of Serbia, but as a result of some sort of a civil war in 1999, Kosovo emerged as a separate country. So these are some of the instances of disintegration of states which actually had been given the stamp of approval by the United Nations and the world community following the end of the Second World War. Now in 1999, in fact, from 1999 onwards, in fact, there was the raising of demands for right to self-determination in other countries as well. You can say that the examples of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia served as models, that other ethnic groups in other countries, who had been actually cobbled together almost in a mechanical fashion by the imposition of force. They actually raised these fundamental questions that why should we not be given our own state? And this actually led to a very serious situation in countries like Afghanistan, Angola, Burundi, Liberia, Tajikistan, and Zaire. As you note, some of these countries, quite a few of these countries are in Africa. In fact, Africa has faced this problem very, very acutely for the simple reason that Africa, before the advent of the Europeans, actually, European colonial powers, did not really have fixed borders or fixed entities and so on and so forth. In fact, the territorial borders in Africa were drawn by the colonial powers essentially according to their own conveniences. So therefore you can imagine that once the colonial powers departed, these ethnic groups, who had been cobbled together, in fact, they began to raise demands for autonomy, for secession, for independence, and so on and so forth. And this is what actually led to these very serious situations. Apart from that, actually, there were also failed states. This is a particular term which is used to denote states which actually have ceased to become a functional entity in the sense as we understand a state. Somalia can be given as an example in the early 90s. Sierra Leone in Africa, again, these two countries are located in Africa, and so on and so forth. So this is one aspect of it. The second aspect actually deals where I would refer to is as globalization. Most of you are probably familiar with this term, globalization. Globalization, actually, this is something that came into prominence following the end of the Cold War. Essentially, what globalization meant was that, there was a steady expansion of linkages, among the states of the world across territorial boundaries. And these linkages that I am referring to were political linkages, economic linkages, cultural linkages, and so on and so forth. And this kind of globalization actually touched many lives, and in many respects actually it tended to sideline the authority of the state, especially in the developing countries. Let me give you a specific example. Let us take the example of, say, economic globalization. As a result of, the end of the Cold War and particularly the onset of globalization, the transnational corporations became very powerful. you understand what transnational corporations are. I mean, a corporation, for instance, which has its commercial, trading, and economic activities spread across many countries and not just confined to one country. I'm sure you are familiar with many of the names of these companies. I'm not going to specifically mention any name, but I'm sure you understand what I'm referring to. Now, states in Latin America and East Asia were very badly affected as a result of this kind of globalization, economic globalization and commercial globalization. I'm referring particularly to Indonesia and Argentina. Indonesia in Asia and Argentina in Latin America. Now, the need for many of these backward states was actually, of financial assistance. Because what happened was that, these countries, as their economies expanded, as their population expanded, their activities expanded, and they simply did not have a sufficient amount of funds to finance these activities. So they had to turn to external sources, and these external sources actually essentially were many of the international economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, as well as, of course, they had to attract capital from other countries, foreign direct investment, and so on and so forth. Now, this, of course, created a very awkward situation in the sense that they did not have always full control over the kind of capital that came into their country. Now, I'm sure you can visualize, you can envisage a situation where, for instance, money is being invested from state A to state B. Now, that money, for instance, and it's not being invested by the government of the state A, but by private corporations. Now, obviously, these corporations will feel free. Why are they putting money into state B? Obviously, they feel that they will be able to make a profit. But then if a particular situation arises where they perceive that they will no longer be able to make the kind of profit that they had originally expected, so they will withdraw from that, their capital from that country. Now, you can, without being an expert in economics, you can envisage, you can visualize the consequences of this kind of flight of capital. Because what will happen actually is that the money that was funding, for instance, many of the activities in state B will no longer be there. So there will be a consequent effect on the economy concerned. Its stock market will be affected. Its currency will be affected, and so on and so forth. So in other words, it will have actually, it's a very complex phenomenon. So I will not going into the details, the technical details, but I'm sure you can understand even from the point of view of a layman that if such a situation happens, then of course it will be a very bad thing. Now, this is exactly what happened in East Asia in the late 1990s and in Latin America in the first decade of the 21st century. Finally, I would like to mention the political field. Even in the field of politics, the actions and policies of the states are being questioned by civil society, comprising essentially non-governmental organizations with active interest in human rights, in environment, and development. In fact, many of these NGOs actually, they operate, some of them are so powerful, because they are funded from external sources that in many respects actually they can flout the authority of the government of the state concerned. Now, it is not possible to go into the details, but I'm sure you understand the basic point that I'm making. Of course, states which are strong, which have strong governments and so on and so forth, they are able to control the activities of these groups. But states which are not very strong, and there are many states which are not very strong, they are not able to control the activities of these groups. So therefore, there are negative implications for overall authority and standing of these states. So I hope from these specific examples and points that I have discussed, you are able to get a clear picture how nation states actually have come under challenges of various kinds during the post-Cold War era, and as a result of it, their authority has been in many respects substantially weakened. Thank you.